Tanzania for an amazing tour. We can all catch our breath. I'm very sensitive to smell, so that was hard for me, but really cool facility. I'm afraid we do have to do the talk in English. We were requested to, so I will try to speak slowly and clearly, but please do stop me at any time to ask questions. So I'll just start by briefly introducing both of us. This is my colleague and very old dear friend, Dr. Abigail Ross. Abby and I actually did our PhD work in Encarafons National Park, the tropical dry deciduous forest in the Northwest, in the same lab at the University of Toronto. We overlapped in the field for a couple of months and have stayed in touch since then, and that was back in 2010. So since receiving her PhD, Abby went on to be a professor at Rock Valley College in Illinois, and decided to give that up and devote herself full-time to conservation and the development of graduate students, especially in Madagascar, providing many opportunities, including maybe some of you have applied for the TDARFAC grants. Abby now full-time runs the Dr. Abigail Ross Foundation for Applied Conservation. The students here, the Malagasy students especially, should definitely check it out. She does a great deal to support graduate scientific research in the country. My name is Kim Valenta. As I mentioned, I did my PhD at the University of Toronto. We both actually have our PhDs in anthropology, which is weird because I would not say that either one of us is really an anthropologist. I mainly studied plants for my dissertation, working on the chemical ecology of plants and plant and lemur and plant and bird interactions. After my PhD at Toronto, I was a postdoc for 4 years at McGill University, and I actually switched from Madagascar to working in Uganda, mainly in Kibale National Park with Dr. Colin Chapman, but I just could not leave Madagascar alone. I then worked briefly at Duke University before taking a permanent position at the University of Florida, where I am now. Additionally, since 2012, I have run a local NGO that is called the Mad Dog Initiative. And what that does, if maybe you've heard of us, we go out, we send veterinarians to the areas in and around national parks to do spay, neuter, and vaccination of the street dogs and cats to basically try to humanely reduce their population. We also run camera trap grids, do line transect surveys, and all sorts of community outreach work in and around the national parks. We, 3 years ago, I'm not really sure when, built a new research station in Madagascar, which is in the Mitsinzu forest. And yeah, that's who we are. So we do a whole bunch of stuff, but today we're excited to talk to you about the project that Abby and I got to start together, which is a new green corridor. Basically, what we decided to do was realizing that many of the national parks here are small fragments of forest, and that wildlife populations cannot cross the savanna matrix between these forests. We decided to start focusing our efforts on the creation of corridors to reconnect very biodiverse national parks within the country. We are doing that at my field site of Andasibe-Mantadia National Park, which I'm sure many of you have been to, probably worked in, probably visited. And we know that basically these two flagship parks, Analamazoatra in the south, Mantadia in the north, have been disconnected because of deforestation for the grazing of cattle since at least the 1960s. I'll show you a map on the next slide. Here we go. So this is what it looks like from above. Up here you have Andasibe-Mantadia National Park. Down here you have Analamazoatra, which is what most people just call Andasibe. Here's Mitsinzu Forest. It was always sort of my dream to reconnect these two forests via a corridor, which Abby's showing, thank you, Abby, via a corridor. However, we had no idea how to do it. As I'm sure you all know, land title and ownership in Madagascar can be very politically sensitive. It can also be very, very difficult. And land ownership for Vaza is not possible in the country. So I happened to be throwing a party for the Mad Dog Initiative to celebrate our new research station 2 years ago. And an old pair of students of mine, Dr. Sue and Priska, actually approached me at the party to say that they now worked in this area here. Basically, this area outlined in blue was privately purchased in, I think, 2020. by a Malagasy man named Mr. Kazim Bakar. And Mr. Kazim's goal is basically to reforest a corridor and conserve the remaining forest. When I heard this, I immediately said, I think I can help, we want to help, and we immediately just started to write grants and start to make many maps to plan effectively the best way to connect this disconnected corridor. This is what it looks like. I'm sure you're all familiar with this type of landscape. It's basically what happens when cattle come in. You burn down the trees to make the new growth. The cattle come in, they eat it, and then it regrows a little, but just in invasive species. And native species can't survive, and we know animals cannot transmit through this landscape. So I think you might be next.
Yes. Okay, so everyone already knows all of this stuff in this room, but I thought it would be helpful just to kind of highlight some positive impacts of reforestation on the environment as well as surrounding communities. So as you know, the more biodiversity that is present, the more stable and also dynamic that habitat or ecoregion is. The reforested areas provide a safe haven for various endemic plant and wildlife species, including 12 lemur species, which I'll show on the next slide. As many of you know, and as Kim has studied, lemurs play a vital role as seed dispersers, which is the process by which seeds are spread and transported away from the parent plant, allowing for their germination and colonization of new areas. Corridors are really important for increasing genetic diversity by recreating habitat to facilitate that important movement of wildlife, thereby contributing to the overall health of the ecosystem. Forests are also super effective at capturing and storing carbon dioxide, which we know is a major greenhouse gas responsible for climate change, and also contributes to the global efforts to reduce overall carbon emissions. The roots of the native trees which we plant help prevent soil erosion and improves the process by which water on the ground enters the soil, in turn leading to healthier soil over time. Reforestation not only will preserve the fertility of the land, but also will benefit local communities who rely on the forests for their livelihoods, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in our talk. Kind of long-term kind of vision, a restored forest corridor will attract more ecotourists to the area, which will boost the local economy and increase employment opportunities in the Andasibe region. And we think that by promoting sustainable ecotourism very carefully and delicately, that we can create a win-win situation for both humans and wildlife.
Okay, so what we're doing with this project, just to kind of break it down, is that the map that we created to connect represents 150 hectares of land that is to be reforested. 1 hectare, for those of you who don't know, is 100 meters by 100 meters. This is ish, because of course the landscape here is not flat. What we're doing is we're planting 1,500 native seedlings that are grown in 2 separate nurseries in each hectare, and we're doing that for 150 hectares. So I can't do the math that fast, but it's 200,000 some seedlings at the end of the day. For planting, we've hired 10 local members from the community, from that landscape, to actually facilitate the planting. And we've been really lucky to work with a wonderful man named Monsieur Claude in Andasibe, who used to be a guide, is super knowledgeable, and actually since he was a boy, and he's 55 now, it was his dream to reconnect these 2 parks. He's actually leading the charge. He's the one that's out in front of the planters, making sure that we're getting the right mix of native seedlings, making sure that everything's being monitored carefully. Of course, we're already bringing kind of sustainable livelihoods to this, not only through the hiring of the planters and Monsieur Claude and the other seedling monitor. We are also basically full-time running 2 native seedling nurseries. One in this landscape, which we'll refer to as the Eco Vision landscape, the privately owned land of Monsieur Kazim, and one with Mitsinju Forest, which is a community-run forest association where my research station happens to live. And the idea, again, is to create a native forest corridor to connect these two parks, as well as to facilitate, ultimately, when the forest is older, maybe some community-based ecotourism or research opportunities for the people that live in this landscape. Maybe you know, maybe you don't know, Analamazoatra is the most visited national park in Madagascar. 83% of tourists to Madagascar will visit Andasibe. There are 3 times as many ecotourists in this landscape as there are local people. If you've been to Andasibe, you know it's like Bazaar City, right? They're everywhere. People come from all over the world. And I think they come here, A, of course, for the magnificent biodiversity, but B, for anyone who's ever tried to travel in Madagascar, you realize how challenging it can be to go, sometimes even short distances. Andasibe is, of course, only 4 hours by pretty good road. So we thought this would be a great place to kind of start it, and hopefully this community, if we build more forest, can capture some of that really good ecotourist revenue.
So as I mentioned, there's 12 lemur species that can be found in this landscape. And as many of you probably already know, that lemurs are classified now as the most endangered mammals in the world. As of 2020, the IUCN Red List lists 98% of lemur species are facing extinction, and of those 98%, 31% are designated as critically endangered species. So as we all are in this room together, we all know that the need is very pressing and very immediate. Critically endangered, if you're not familiar, essentially means that if we don't immediately address the problems causing population declines, the species will likely go extinct from the wild. So there are 3 critically endangered species in this landscape, pictured here. So the black and white ruffed lemur, the diadem sifaka, and the indri. Yeah, okay, so Kim talked about our kind of overall objectives already, but you're probably wondering, all right, so what have we accomplished so far, and where are we heading in the future? As Kim mentioned, I just wanted to highlight that this is a really, really collaborative project with Ecovision Village, which is a Malagasy organization in the landscape, with Mitsinju Association, and we have Tatun here representing Mitsinju, so we're really lucky. Mad Dog Initiative, many, many organizations are really working together to make this possible. Last summer, we started planting the first 30 hectares of the 150 hectare corridor, and so far we've planted 36,000 seedlings. So that's about how many seedlings fit in those 30 hectares. We're planting, as Kim mentioned, it's between 1,200 and 1,500 seedlings depending on the exact kind of configuration of that landscape, and then we do go back and replace seedlings if they die. So we're monitoring all of that, and Kim will talk about that more in detail in a second. So we completed the first 30 hectares a couple of months ago, and then last week our teams went to Ecovision and we started planting the next 30 hectares of forest. So it was really exciting to be in that landscape again and start doing that last week. At the same time, we wanted to kind of check on what was going on with the project, and we kind of revisited and refined some of our methods and techniques we were doing to improve them. For example, we came up with a better tree tagging methodology than what we had previously used. So we're definitely making changes as we go and kind of correcting and improving ourselves along the way. Definitely still much a learning process for us. We've received funding through grants for 63 of the hectares so far, and of course, like any biologist, we need more money. So we're still working to fundraise to fund the next part of the project.
Okay, so just some of the basic seedling mortality data. Unfortunately, and I'm sure if you're a field biologist, you can understand, the data went sideways. Something went wrong, and so we don't have as good of data as we expected to have. I'm still at the process of entering the last of our seedling monitoring and mortality data, and hopefully even in the next 2 weeks we'll have more to share. But generally what we're seeing in the first 1 year is about 17% mortality. That is higher than what we want, but better than I had actually thought we would get. What we're doing is basically an experiment. So this whole thing, everything that we do, we're trying to measure everything in order to understand what works best in this landscape in terms of what are the species, what's the best age for seedlings to be planted to ensure reduced mortality. We're also doing an experiment with mycorrhizally seeding the land. So a couple of researchers working elsewhere in Madagascar found in their own smaller plots that if you pre-seeded the seedlings with mycorrhizal fungi, basically local fungi collected from local soils, that seedling mortality was actually drastically reduced. So we did an experiment. 15 of the first 30 hectares we planted in Mitsinzu, in the seedling nursery. And Mitsinzu is a leader in this landscape in terms of understanding basically what seedlings work in this landscape. They've been doing native forest reforestation for a long time. So in 15 of the plots, we planted this mycorrhizally seeded seedling, and in the other 15, we planted the same species of seedlings, but without this mycorrhizal fungi. As you can see, this isn't a very good image here, I'm sorry, but the mycorrhizally seeded fungi had slightly less, but not significantly less mortality compared to the EcoVision seedlings. So we're gonna continue this experiment in the next 30 hectares and figure out if something else is going on. Things like slope, things like aspect, things like extreme local community of what's going on. We're also hoping in the next 30 hectares to increase that plant species diversity and to ideally be planting older seedlings. Even though the data are not yet analyzed, there's a clear signal that the longer the seedling grows in the nursery, the more likely it is to survive once it's planted.
And just to quickly add on to that, so in terms of the plant species diversity, right now we're planting just over 60 different plant species. So we're hoping to increase that in this next 30 hectares.
Here's a picture of it. So this is, you can see, when we originally drew the map, our hectares were these beautiful, perfect squares. And this is what the hectares actually look like. So the ones in blue are planted with seedlings from Mitsinzu, and the ones in green are planted with seedlings grown in EcoVision. And that's just to give you a sense. So this area up here is actually contiguous primary forest that is basically the south of Mantadia National Park. And the first 30 hectares kind of abuts this river on one end. This is the western frontier of EcoVision's private land, and we'll continue it all the way down till it reaches the river that separates the private land from Analamazoatra. And there's Monsieur Claude, being a boss.
And this just gives you an example of this seedling was planted last year, and it's a good lemur food tree. The lemurs love to eat DT mate, as many of you have shown in your own studies. But this is just to give an example of like the growth or what it looks like this next year.
Yes, we went back and already the seedlings from last year are this tall. So they're loving life.
Okay, so one of the challenges that we are facing is how to mitigate the spread of an invasive plant species called Desmodium. So Desmodium is a proto-carnivorous plant species that's native to Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Peru, and Venezuela, so many countries in South America. It was originally introduced to East Africa and also Madagascar to improve livestock productivity. To get into the nitty-gritty a little bit, it's a large perennial legume with stems that can grow several meters long and has large ground coverage. So you can see the ground coverage here and also like underneath these purple flowers all along here. This is a seedling that we planted, and you can see that, you know, all this Desmodium has come in like pretty soon thereafter planting the seedling. And here, this is just an image to show like the importance of maintaining the land and going back to remove the desmodium from around the seedlings we've already planted. Desmodium is known to be an increasing problem in the disturbed areas around Andasibe. And one of the problems with it, you can't really tell from the image, but each one of the stems is covered with these like really short hooked hairs that actually can trap live animals like small chameleons, frogs, and bats, which causes them to die. These stems become really, really sticky during the wet season and trap even more animals during that time. Desmodium is used by people for grazing their zebu, and it's commonly used in foraging mixtures. Since we know, and Kim mentioned earlier, that the reforestation area was a former zebu pasture, it really makes sense, and it was likely that desmodium was applied here in the relatively recent past. There are no natural consumers of desmodium either. It'd be really cool if something just loved to eat it, but that is not the case. So it grows kind of unchecked in the landscape and outcompetes native plant species for both light and nutrients. It also has a really deep taproot, which adds to the eradication being more difficult or challenging. We're working on some mitigation strategies right now. Part of that we kind of all discussed with Mr. Claude last week. And if anyone knows anything about desmodium or invasive plant species, we are very open to your ideas and would love to talk to you afterwards. There's been an interesting idea that was applied in Tanzania where fresh desmodium leaves were collected, dried, and then the crude extract was actually used to create a bioherbicide that was effective against other invasive plant species. But I think probably this would be difficult to do in this region.
Okay, so in addition to making the forest corridor, we are scientists and we want to measure everything that we can in hopes that we, again, can use this information to A, get more money, and B, basically optimize our efforts. So one of the major projects that we are doing, and Morissette is here, one of the PhD students working on the project, we got some really good funding from Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, and they're very interested in Morissette's work, which is basically checking whether or not the 6 diurnal lemur species that we have in the landscape can actually travel across the anthropogenic matrix to interbreed with each other. These are small pockets of forest. We're pretty sure, of course, that these animals are not able to cross the anthropogenic savanna matrix, but what Morissette's work will show us in hopefully the next 2 years or so, when she's done collecting all of her poo samples and doing all of her lab work in Mahalina Lab, is basically how far separated these populations are, how much evidence there is for inbreeding depression in the existing populations, and then hopefully in 10 years or so, when the corridor becomes passable by the larger diurnal species, whether or not we start to see interbreeding between previously separated populations in real time. So Morissette does a lot of poo collection all over the place, and then a lot of work in the Mahalina Lab. We of course assume that the forest fragments are effectively acting as islands that the lemurs cannot disperse from. For example, one species in our landscape, the black and white ruffed lemur, Varesia variegata, are known to be edge intolerant to 1 kilometer. Effectively, if you do not create a corridor or a forest that is at least 2 kilometers wide in each direction, the Varesia will not go in it. So that's another thing we're thinking about as we study the refaunation and the reconnection of these landscapes. What's the minimum width to get all of the species to cross, and how deep are the edge effects in this landscape? We're also doing mouse lemur morphometrics. This is kind of weird. This is because I am in an anthropology department, and one of my actual anthropologist colleagues was very interested in this question of mouse lemurs, which we have Microcebus ravelobensis, no, not ravelobensis, lehilehitsara. I'm a bad primatologist. Goodman's mouse lemur in this landscape, named after, of course, the wonderful Steve Goodman. basically was interested in whether this variation in landscape type is causing morphometric variation. As you can imagine, if you are a mouse lemur surviving in a savanna, you probably have very different locomotion needs relative to a mouse lemur surviving in like a pristine primary forest in Mantadia. This project is ongoing. We took these 2 photographs last week. So we're out there capturing mouse lemurs, my very tired PhD students, as well as, who is that?
Zawani, Marisa, Caitlin.
Okay, Zawani is also here, Morissette and Caitlin, are basically working to live trap these mouse lemurs. We trick them into traps with bananas, we measure a bunch of things about them, and then we'll basically look at landscape effects on their morphometrics. Oh, also, the Lincoln Park grant. I don't know too much about this project, but we have another wonderful PhD student. That's his real name, but he goes by Ari. He's been working in the landscape all around, so in Analamazoatra, Mitsinzu, Mantadia, and adjacent places like Maramizaha, to investigate the effects of habitat fragmentation, in particular on our flagship species, the Indri. So he does things like quantifying patch characteristics and habitat quality, estimating lemur population densities and biodiversity. Basically, he goes out all the time, counts lemurs, tries to describe where they live in order to understand the types of environments that we can create for them, as well as further identifying dispersal barriers to gene flow. We also started this new project with another PhD student of mine from the University of Florida. These are also pictures from last week. This is acoustic biodiversity monitoring. So we got a grant to get a bunch of audio moths, which are those things up in the corner. Thank you, Abby. And I know Tanzano, you were saying that you've got an acoustic biodiversity monitoring project here. It's this very simple little device that basically allows you to capture the sounds of all of the animals within approximately a 1 kilometer range of where you set them. We had to create these poles to mount them on, because in many cases we are mounting them in places without forests to see basically what, if anything, is able to live in the abandoned pasture lands. And it looks like the band Devo, if anyone is old enough to know. Anyway, so we have like sticks and plastic hats on them, and then we put clothing on top of the plastic hats so that it's not just constantly capturing the sound of rainfall. We have 300 days of rain every single year. The data that's generated is going to be enormous. So he's probably, this PhD student, we call him Big Data Tom. He's really into big data, he's really into AI, and that's sort of gonna be his jam. We're setting them in 3 different places. So in Mantadia, in the pristine primary forest, in the reforestation corridor, so that in real time we can actually measure and see what are the animals that are starting to come back and how long does it take. And then also in the degraded, abandoned pasture land to see if anything at all is able to live there.
A long-term component to the reforestation project is conducting educational outreach in the Andasibe region and also here in Antananarivo. So as we know, the evidence overwhelmingly shows that when communities understand the direct benefits of preserving the environment, they're much more likely to become active participants themselves. Moreover, environmental outreach fosters a sense of stewardship and responsibility. It empowers individuals and communities to take action, whether it's through reforestation projects, wildlife protection, or sustainable practices. This involvement is really crucial for the success of any conservation effort and ours in particular. Our outreach programs include various educational workshops, field trips, and hands-on activities like tree planting. This past February, we organized the Mitsinju Youth Club on Kanzizi Miala to visit the reforestation site, and that is Tatoon's youth group in Andasibe. So that was really amazing that she's really spearheaded these efforts for us, and yeah, we're so lucky that she has become involved. So during this field trip, about 30 youth ranging in ages from 7 to 17, so really broad age span, spent the day learning about lemurs and the importance of reforestation. They also planted 216 seedlings that day, which was really cool. And we actually learned from the data that the seedlings the kids planted had a lower mortality rate than some of the seedlings that we planted. So that was pretty awesome. And last month we arranged for an overnight field trip, and Dr. Rindra and all of Tani Ketsa and everyone helped so much to do this. So we arranged an overnight field trip to Andasibe for about 50 students from a primary school here in Tana with Tani Ketsa. So before the trip, we kind of had like a little conservation week and program that overlapped with World Chameleon Day, and it's been really exciting to kind of see these things get established and grow. This is Mr. Claude here talking to some of the students, and we really think that these initiatives create a strong connection and help promote the culture of conservation that can be passed down through generations. And you know, the environmental outreach is not just about protecting wildlife, it's about building a future for both nature and people. And this is personally something I'm really passionate about. So thanks for everyone for helping so much with this. Oh, you can't read that at all. Okay, so this happened last night. We actually made this slide partly last night and this morning. So last week, after a very lengthy negotiation, we received, we think, permission from EcoVision to build a school, which will take the form of more like a community learning center that's just open to anyone who wants to learn. So we don't know the exact location of the school, so Ani is gonna kind of go and scout it out for us, but it will be somewhere, I think, around here, right, in the eastern part of EcoVision land. Since Mantadia is experiencing the most pressure along its eastern border going into the forest that way. So in the coming weeks, this, which you cannot see, is a survey that we developed yesterday that Zoani will go and distribute the survey to the various communities living in this region to help gauge what the community wants, what they need most in terms of like the types of curriculum that they would be interested in. So this is kind of ongoing and just starting out. Do you want to add anything to this?
This is a very interesting problem that we faced recently, and we spoke about it with Tatun, Zuani, Radu was at the meeting, all of the folks that were in the landscape last week. Basically, Monsieur Kazim, the private owner of the land, is very interested in building a school. However, he does not want a school that is the Malagasy national curriculum. He does not think it is valuable for students necessarily to be learning about the history of France or Christopher Columbus, right? And it's kind of true. Like in many ways, I agree with him. He also thinks that in many of these particularly underserved communities that are very close to all of this ecotourism and potentially research money, that making a curriculum that really gives them hard skills that they can use to get gainful employment is a very important thing. And so basically, on the other hand, we have already obtained the money to build the school through a grant. The donor of the money wants to see a school with a normal curriculum. The owner of the land refuses a school with a normal curriculum. So we all met over lunch last week and tried to figure this out. Where we're at now is I think that the owner has basically tentatively agreed to let us go in and ask all of these questions of the people that we encounter. And the questions which you cannot see are things like, would you take a class in the wildlife of Madagascar? Would you take a class in sustainable agroforestry or fisheries? Basically trying to gauge what people will actually show up to should we build this school. But it is a constant, very kind of delicate negotiation. And the idea, is basically to have it here. This is what's called the Fukutani Androy, so it's just to the east of this red line that you cannot see very well. This is a community that Monsieur Kazim refers to as uncontacted. They basically, as far as we know, lack all services, and they are doing a very efficient job right now of converting all of the primary forest into charcoal. So just 2 years ago, all of this was intact, primary, basically irreplaceable forest. It's all gone. It is all gone. And so there's some urgency to basically reach out to these people, to this community, and sort of get into a position where we can start to have a conversation in particular about why this region and why Madagascar is so important, and finding other ways for them to earn their livelihoods. But it is a delicate process. We're going as fast as we can without stepping on any toes, hopefully. Okay, this is our last slide. So this is the Vauvau Bay, I think. This is an idea I had last year, kind of out of nowhere, which is there are so many amazing people here in Madagascar working to protect and conserve what remains of the forest. At the same time, of course, 90% of the forest cover is gone in the shortest land tenure of humans on any place, anywhere. It is still rapidly disappearing. And I feel like many of us work in our little regions a little bit in a vacuum. As well, it can be very, very difficult to find funding to do this kind of thing, mostly to find funding to maintain it. Once you build the forest, you have to monitor it, you have to patrol it, there's many other things that you have to think about. You don't just plant a seed and walk away and everything's done. So I thought about this, why not, since we're all working in these little corners of Madagascar alone, why not work together and get really, really big money for a really, really big idea? The idea being to create one mega corridor that spans the entire length of Madagascar. For the last year, I've been working along with Abby, and her husband is a cartographer, so we've brought him into it. We've basically been working to create a data-driven map based on Landsat images to identify where there is existing forest, to overlay the shape files of existing protected areas under MNP, and then based on various parameters to find the path of least resistance to connect existing protected areas. What you can see, again, very badly, protected areas are in pink. The existing intact forest is in green, getting smaller every single day. And the line that you cannot really see on this big map, but you can see here, is basically showing you a model where we've told it to connect, again, via various parameters, the intact pieces of protected area at a width of 2 kilometers. The idea is, after many discussions, we had hoped to make one big ring around the country. There's no way that's going to happen. Tropical dry deciduous forest is a different animal. The West is very hard. A close friend of ours actually visited from the West. He does a lot of the reforestation efforts in Nkarafonsk National Park. He runs Planet Madagascar and is a professor at the University of Guelph. We just can't use the same parameters. We cannot use the same models in the East and in the West. The forests are different. And so basically the idea is to create one, possibly 2 mega corridors from here all the way up to here, ideally at a minimum width of 2 kilometers. After the data-driven map is complete, our goal is to get money to get all of the people who are toiling in their various forests to all come together, look at the map of their region, and identify whether this line makes sense or not. For example, we tell the computer the corridor cannot pass through a human community. We are not displacing people. The corridor cannot pass through a rice paddy. But there are things that Landsat can't pick up. For example, is there a massive erosion scar or a cliff that we're just not seeing from space that would prevent the line from going here? So the idea is by next year we have this ready. We chunk up the corridor into little pieces and give it to the folks that are experts in their various regions. And then we go to the Gates Foundation, and then we go to National Geographic, and then we go to all of the places that would fund this and just need an excuse to do it. So we don't know what we'll call it yet. We bought the domain name for Lemur Superhighway. Madagascar Mega Corridor, I don't know. Would love to hear your thoughts. And of course it would have different names in Madagascar depending on the section of the region that it went through. Yeah, so thank you guys so much for listening, and thank you for coming, and thank you to all of the folks who worked so hard on this project and who are here today. We have Zuwani, Morissette, Madame Tutoon, Dr. Rindra, and Radu. Dr. Freddie, of course, has also been very, very instrumental in supporting a lot of the Malagasy graduate students that are absolutely critical to a lot of these scientific projects.